It's the late 1970s. The world is turning, and with it, the wheels of imagination spin faster. Magnavox has embedded themselves in history for their Odyssey, while Atari rose from the ashes of a crippling lawsuit. In Japan, Nintendo and Epoch were battling to be the very best, and in the shadows worldwide, smaller companies desired to join the fray. These juggernauts were engaged in consumer electronic wars, not only in the living room, but also in your local arcade. These moments would set the framework for the golden age of the arcades. And because of this, these same warring factions sought to bring the arcade home. From 1976 to 1992, this period would be known as the second generation of video gaming, commonly remembered for the crash.
The AY3-8500 chip, the catalyst for an entire generation of gaming and the facilitator of many childhood experiences. This small chip allowed companies to break into the industry, and they did so by stepping on each other's toes like a messed up two-step. Last episode we talked about the first generation of gaming and the two major American competitors that created it, Magnavox and Atari. With Atari's home Pong, Magnavox clamped down on many companies that essentially ripped off the idea of the Odyssey. And at this point, it was time for companies to start creating their own ideas, whether by hardware or software. This is a lesson that you would think would stick, but unfortunately it didn't. Atari was recovering from a major loss from their court case with Magnavox, but Atari had one major advantage over Magnavox that they couldn't even attempt to match: the smoke-filled air and soda-stained carpets of the arcade. In the 1970s, Atari was leading the pack for arcade games with memorable titles that mostly relied on the successes of Pong, like Pong Doubles, Super Pong, and a wide berth of other fun time-wasters that were consistently rewrapped. This would happen with Tank, which was repackaged into a more social cocktail cabinet format, then a sequel, Tank 2, then Tank 3, Tank 8, which could have 8 tanks and players simultaneously, then finally Ultra Tank in 1978. But even in those conditions, these game franchises brought in tons of revenue. The real battle was yet to come. Companies were already thinking, if those games could be intriguing to the general public in the arcade, why not try to bring it home?
The issue was nobody had done it yet. The best thing in home gaming so far was Coleco's Telstar Arcade, which was a triangular monstrous amalgamation of a steering wheel, a revolver, and a Pong machine with the old games that were popular in the first generation. Of course, Atari brought Pong home, and that business model, while successful, was detrimental. Often you don't hear about the original crash of the video game industry because it tends to be overshadowed by another moment in gaming, a much larger crash. This first crash existed because companies were pumping out over 900 consoles, of which only one game was hardwired. Companies would spend $100,000 and $250,000 for a console to have a first run, and that run would only be viable for 3 months before the next greatest same idea came out. So you can pretty much see that older ideas were sinking the industry down and pulling it down more and more. This is where Atari sought to break the mold of what was known by creating a programmable console. It would be called Project Stella. As we mentioned before, the standard for chips, if you will, was the AY3-8500. But Atari wanted to create something new, something better. In 1971, in this year, another tiny little company that you might have heard of, Intel, created the first microprocessor. It was designated the 4004. And the power of this microprocessor would allow for complicated software to be created and integrated rather than the simple yes or no logics of supercomputers. For many developers, this is what they needed to create a programmable home console.
In the previous episode, we talked about the lawsuit between Magnavox and Atari. It started in 1974, but that court battle lasted until 1977. In that time span, Atari wasn't just sitting around waiting. Atari acquired Cyan Engineering, which employed Steve Meyer and Larry Emmons. These two saw the potential to use the Motorola 6800, an 8-bit processor, in future developments, leading to negotiations between the companies. Unfortunately, Atari, as we've established before, had a bad practice of opening negotiations with companies then running away. Heck, look at how they fled from Nutting Associates in the previous episode. While talking to Motorola, engineers began another set of negotiations with MOS Technology, which had released the 6502 microprocessor. Behind Motorola's back, Atari secretly elected to go with it instead. This led to a cost-reduced version of the 6502, known as the 6507, or also known as the TIA, the Television Interface Adapter, the brain of what would eventually become known as the Atari 2600. Motorola was livid and would initiate a lawsuit against MOS the week after the deal was signed.
The chip was selected, but it wasn't ready yet, and in the shadows lurked a new competitor that nobody expected to join the fray. A company that was known for cameras and semiconductors, sticking their necks out into a very volatile and very rewarding market.
So we have Atari with their TIA, it hadn't been incorporated yet, and time was ticking. That's how many of these early gaming projects went. Who could make it fastest and who could do it in a way that was financially viable. While Cyan Engineering was messing around with MOS and Motorola, another company known as Alpex Computer Corporation had an idea to create their own console that would feature removable cartridges. Initially, it used the Intel 8080 chip, but repeated attempts at pitching it didn't really go that well. It wasn't until the Intel 8080 chip was changed out for the Fairchild F8 chip that people were interested, more specifically engineer Jerry Lawson, who pitched the idea to Fairchild and suggested licensing the technology. That occurred in 1976, and the Fairchild Channel F was born, shocking Atari, and for the first time in a long time putting them in second place and officially kicking off the second generation of gaming.
Atari would end up rushing to compete with the Fairchild Channel F, but there were two big issues. For starters, the idea was expensive, and with the lawsuit from Magnavox on the horizon, there was no way financially they could do it. And the second issue was that they had no idea what to encase the Stella in. They tackled the latter issue by hiring Gene Lundrum, who was a consultant in consumer goods who ironically had just finished working with Fairchild for their Channel F. After the consultation, Lundrum suggested giving Stella a living room feel, make it plastic with a wood finish that would need to be idiot-proof and yes, even child-proof. He even suggested doing 4 dedicated hardwired titles, but that would be scrapped in the later years of development. After all, it was the cartridge era of gaming now, and Atari needed to have cartridges with ROM boards that would survive a static-filled environment, kind of like what Fairchild did. And what better way to figure that out than hire Douglas Hardy, who had just designed Fairchild's cartridges. Man, Atari was clever, weren't they? But the issue is money. Through and through, that was always the prevailing issue. And in Ready Go Gaming Show special episode on Atari, we discussed that before the Atari video computer system, aka the Atari 2600, Atari was in dire financial straits. To resolve this, Nolan Bushnell began looking for other companies that would be willing to not only fast-track Stella, but to also pull them out of the issue with Magnavox. The company that would inevitably accept this would be Warner Communication, who was suffering in the film and music industries. Warner Brothers purchased Atari for $28 million and agreed to provide $128 million to Atari to fast-track the Atari video computer system. A year later, it was released for the world to enjoy. On this console, Atari would take their arcade games and publish them to the VCS. It was safe to assume that if Atari had an arcade game, that they would put it on their VCS. And if another company had an arcade game, they would try and port it to the VCS.
The second generation of consoles was alive, but the catalog of games was being built on low standards for quick profit that would rot at the core of an entire industry. Meanwhile, from across the ocean, the Japanese game market watched quietly as Atari Shock began to rock the foundations of the American video game market.
Under the new leadership of Warner Brothers, Atari was radically changed. If you've ever seen the Netflix documentary High Score, it did a really fantastic job discussing many of the aspects of gaming history. One item that was covered was the highly relaxed environment of Atari at the time. Most of the individuals at Atari were hippies by nature. It was all about no formal dress code, working when you wanted to, and, yes, a gratuitous amount of marijuana. But the laid-back standard of Atari under Nolan Bushnell was pushed out the door when Ray Kazar was selected as president, once Warner Brothers took over. Blue jeans and t-shirts were ripped off and replaced by suits and business casual, time cards were mandatory and no drugs were allowed. Atari went from a calm, relaxed environment to a soulless corporate machine. Ray Kazar was known for being cruel and overly strict with his programmers, leading to the notable departures of Atari programmers David Crane, Bob Whitehead, Larry Kaplan, and Alan Miller. These four alone contributed to 60% of the games sold by Atari, and their departure was a major hit to the company. But these four didn't stop making games. In fact, they formed a team. They brought with them the trade secrets of how to develop games for the Atari 2600 and branded themselves Activision.
This sent Ray Kazar into a whole new world of pissed off, because Activision definitely, without fail, stole the secrets of Atari programming to make their own games and took them to court in 1980, claiming that members of Activision signed non-disclosure agreements and new trade secrets. This was resolved by members of Activision as a corporation, paying a licensing fee for games. This would be known as the first ever iteration of a third-party developer. Activision had set the framework and validated their business model, and from Activision's success, the market began to be flooded with various developers.
Atari made their own games, mostly ports of arcade titles.
Activision made well-known and highly successful titles.
Former Atari employees founded the company iMagic and developed 24 titles for the 2600.
Coleco, who made their own second-generation console, began making titles for all their competitors, both Mattel and Atari.
Comavid strived to make a programming tool for the 2600 and had 5 games.
Data Age created Journey Escape and Frankenstein's Monster.
Games by Apollo released 11 games, none of which were remarkable.
M Network, as the division of Mattel, made a handful of popular ports before getting into it with Atari, who hired programmers on the Intellivision.
Mystique made unlicensed pornographic titles, trying to use sex to sell video games. It didn't work.
Toy makers the Parker Brothers made a handful of games, which were mostly unremarkable.
Spectra Video made a handful of games that all sucked.
Telsys made 6 games. Only one stood out.
Tiger Vision made 10 games for the 2600, leaving 6 more unreleased due to the lack of success. They later became known for LCD games.
US Games struggled to make games for the 2600.
Zonix released multiple games, some known as Double Enders, but failed to maintain viable success.
And finally, ZMAG released 4 games, none of which had success. The market was saturated, and there was zero control of quality assurance. Companies were pumping out games left and right. There was no control of publishing rights. With over 80% of Atari's library featuring lackluster titles, the market slowly began to diminish, and other rising stars in the industry started to feel the pressure too. Mattel's Intellivision and Coleco's ColecoVision were slowly fading to obscurity. The games on the shelf, numerous in nature, found themselves knocked off the wall and into the bargain bin, sometimes being discounted 80% of their retail value. Home computers were taking the spotlight, and effectively, the market crashed in 1983.
On the other side of the Pacific, this was known as Atari Shock. Japanese companies stood tall because they didn't allow the rapid expansion in this generation of gaming. They maintained control. Nintendo's president Hiroshi Yamauchi stated it best: Atari collapsed because they gave too much freedom to third-party developers, and the market was swamped with rubbish games, leading to Nintendo establishing a seal of quality for a console that would come later. In retrospect, the market crash allowed for Commodore to raise the price of their computer, the Commodore 64, bringing in a whole different aspect to gaming. From the ashes of the crash, many companies were destroyed. Atari would be sold and broken up into various aspects. After all, they lost $538 million in the crash. Activision obviously survived, but from the rest we mentioned, they all folded. Casualties of the war known as the second generation of console gaming. The brightest and darkest moment in video gaming history, a necessary evil to ensure the future of gaming as we know it.
The battle was over. The remnants, while injured and shamed, would hold open the door for the next generation of gaming. The losses, while innumerable, taught developers just how important their craft was to ensure the longevity of their industry, and the next generation of gaming would rise as a phoenix, dominated by Japanese game makers, revitalizing the home console market one step at a time. While we addressed the history of some of these companies, at least those that mattered, we want to paint the landscape of video game history by presenting some of the consoles that were created during this time of innovation. Bear in mind, there are at least 17 known second-generation consoles, so for the purposes of this episode, we're only going to talk about the ones that made the biggest impacts, starting with Fairchild.
We talked about Fairchild a little bit earlier, so let's dive a little deeper now. Wallace Kirshner and Lawrence Haskell made a prototype for a home programmable console that utilized the Intel 8080 microprocessor, but nobody would invest in it. Not until they changed out the 8080 for the Fairchild F8. Once this happened, Fairchild enjoyed moderate success with their original run of the Fairchild Channel F, which was further revised through the release of the Fairchild Channel F2, the first console family to have a pause button. With its weird controller and a limited library, it fell short once the Atari 2600 was released, and it didn't stand a chance when the market crashed in '83.
We covered the history of Atari in depth in episode 2 of the Ready Go Gaming Show special, but we can't talk about the early years of video games without Atari. At first, the 2600 was a massive success, and in the end, it was a massive failure. The system had 528 games, many of which were horrid, and that was a major contributor to the crash of 1983. Speaking of 1983, a year prior, they would release the Atari 5200, which, in the naming of the console, retroactively resulted in the renaming of the Atari VCS to 2600, so don't confuse it. The 5200 was cumbersome, and was only a slight improvement over the 2600. It also had a limited library, 69 games to be exact. Atari's assets upon the crash were broken up. Atari's consumer products division was sold to Jack Tramiel in exchange for $240 million in debt, leading to Atari Corporation. Atari retained the arcade division, rebranding as Atari Games, and the phone division, Atari Tel, was sold to Mitsubishi, resulting in one of the first video phones.
With Atari just a husk of its former self, nobody was certain that the name Atari would ever return to power, and it didn't, not in any real way. Now, it is nowhere near the empire that it once reigned over as king of the industry. The remaining scraps would lead to another unremarkable console in the next generation of consoles.
This next console, and more specifically this company, has a very intriguing beginning. Because once Atari ditched Nutting Associates, Bally Manufacturing decided to hop in, wanting a piece of that silicon pie. This led to Bally using a subsidiary, Bally Midway, as a catalyst for their only console release, the Bally Astrocade. But the start of this console was very quiet. The console itself was incredibly confusing, and the entirety of its market was unremarkable. Soon after conception of the Bally Astrocade, Bally would exit the console market.
While Bally Manufacturing exited the console market, Bally Midway's history continues to this day, a company that didn't mind blood, gore, and fatalities.
Well, this is a name that we didn't really cover because, honestly, they didn't do too much after the first generation of consoles. The original Odyssey was a pioneer in the industry, and Ralph Baer did a lot to make sure that his presence was known, even if it was in the courtroom. But once it was time to enter and compete with their nemesis Atari, it didn't really pan out well. Their answer to the 2600 and their continuation of the original Odyssey was known as the Odyssey 2. As you can see, this machine is powerful in its own right, but cumbersome. The games themselves aren't that bad. In fact, you can have a wonderful time enjoying the library of this console, but it couldn't compete with the 2600, despite the apparent praise and cult following that has gathered over the years since its release.
The Magnavox Odyssey 2 was a commercial hit and failure, trying to persevere through the crash. Another attempt at a console would be made to a far smaller audience, in a very particular part of the world, mostly due to the crash.
When you think of Mattel, you likely think of their toys: Fisher-Price, Barbie, Hot Wheels, and more. It was their venture into the gaming industry in 1979, the same year that 2600 was released, that really made them into a video game competitor. The Mattel Intellivision itself is cumbersome, and its gimmick is these slips of paper that would slide inside the controllers to tell you what the buttons did for the game. And if you didn't have those, you kind of had to figure it out for yourself, which made for a frustrating experience. It also had a voice module that was incorporated for such games such as B-17 Bomber, Bomber Squad, Space Spartans, and Tron Solar Sailor. Ironically, one of their major claims to fame was the system changer. This item essentially allowed for 2600 games to be played on the Intellivision, and as you can guess, this would cause some animosity. In fact, it was offered as a modification for free on the first generation Intellivision and was a standalone for their follow-up revision called the Intellivision 2. Mattel had planned to make another version known as the Intellivision 3 and Project Decade, which would have been the Intellivision 4, but this never came to fruition. To be honest, it seemed like Mattel was thinking with the first generation style of thinking, and the Intellivision line ceased in 1990.
It would be quite a while until Mattel made another console, and the reception for their contribution to the 7th generation was lackluster at best. So much so that often it was considered one of the worst video game consoles of all time.
Emerson is a well-known consumer electronics distributor that has been around since 1948, starting as Emerson Phonograph Company. And if that doesn't speak volumes about their game experience, then I don't know what does. In 1982, they released the Arcadia 2001, a smaller footprint on the gaming landscape at the time. It featured controllers akin to the Intellivision and had an unremarkable success as the Arcadia, but a mild success as a cloned system. There are 30 known clones of the console, and every game made was unremarkable. In theory, it looks a lot like Atari, but to be honest, most games in this era looked the same. It was rebranded as the Bandai Arcadia. Shocker, it wasn't entirely successful. Emerson would exit the game industry soon after. Coleco, the leather makers turned video game aficionados. These guys were a lot like Magnavox, and they were guilty of many of the same sins as Magnavox, and countless other companies during the first generation in making tons of consoles. In the second generation, they didn't really learn their lesson with the issues that were thriving. If you can't tell by now, the major downfall of the second generation of gaming was that many of the heavy-hitting titles were shared among consoles, and individuals were not afraid to step on toes. From making hardware to replicate other consoles' games, to blatantly ripping off each other's ideas, the ColecoVision, the last console they would make, did exactly that. In fact, Expansion Module 1 was made specifically to play Atari 2600 games. But the console was wonderful in that it had the first iterations of home ports of many internationally successful arcade games, such as Nintendo's Donkey Kong, Sega's Zaxxon, and numerous others. Aesthetically, it looked quite like the Intellivision, but many would argue that the ColecoVision was far more appealing in the console market. I happen to own a few expansions, Module 1, which I mentioned before, Module number 2, which was actually Coleco's name for their steering wheel peripheral. Module number 3 isn't one that I have on hand yet. It's better known as the Atom, an add-on that turned the ColecoVision into a full-fledged microcomputer. None of this helped them power through the crash of 1983, and since they were one of the major players in the downfall of the industry, Coleco would withdraw from the market, never to return.
Milton Bradley is well known for their board games, mostly the ones where you want to murder your friends. Here's looking at you, Connect 4, and Battleship, and Crossfire, and Twister, and Yahtzee. This company is a household name, all the way back from 1860. That's right, when they came up with the game of the checkered game of life, it was born in 1861, to the sale of 45,000 copies. It was this point they decided to make board games. But in 1982, they decided to work with General Consumer Electronics to release one of the most ambitious consoles ever created. This console would be called the Vectrex, and it would be remembered for being one of the only home-programmable video game consoles to have the output directly on the screen. Utilizing a ROM cartridge and a TV overlay, the Vectrex was praised for being essentially a mini arcade for the home. But once the crash happened, the console failed. Milton Bradley would merge with Hasbro, and then the Vectrex faded into obscurity, costing the company millions of dollars. Milton Bradley didn't stop there, though. They also had one of the first handheld video game systems, the Microvision. The Microvision had a self-sufficient video screen and a tiny library of games, but it was plagued with issues. For starters, it was susceptible to static discharge. The keypad wasn't sustainable and would be crushed easily, and the screen would literally rot away from the heat of the console. It's worth owning, if not for the conversation, but otherwise, completely unremarkable, other than showing Nintendo that a handheld console was possible.
It's time to talk about one of the Japanese contributions to the second generation, which wasn't that much. Nintendo had made a name for themselves throughout history by hitting cultural aspects along the way. But after the release of their first generation consoles, they began focusing primarily on their arcade titles. The one that would stick the most would be a game created by Shigeru Miyamoto in 1981. This game was simple. A man would jump over other barrels and other obstacles to save the girlfriend, and the antagonist, a giant ape. Jumpman would be this protagonist, Pauline would be the girlfriend, and the antagonist, Donkey Kong. Thus, a legacy was born. Jumpman would eventually become Mario, and we suggest taking the time to watch our episode on the Mario franchise if you are interested in that piece of gaming history, because we covered it all. The importance of Donkey Kong was that it cemented Nintendo as a heavy competitor in the arcades, and the title served as a catalyst for many home conversions of the title. For example, on the 2600, the ColecoVision, Amiga 500, Apple II, Commodore 64, and over 8 different other platforms. But the key contribution of the second generation from Nintendo came from an odd inspiration. While riding the bullet train, the Shinkansen, Nintendo game developer Gunpei Yokoi noticed a bored businessman playing on an LCD calculator. This inspired him to create what will be known as the Game & Watch. They made many of these, starting with Ball Toss-Up in the 1980s. Other than that, Nintendo was relatively quiet as they rode the success of the Game & Watch series.
You might notice an interesting parallel between some of the designs of these Game & Watch titles, as they would make a return in the latter history of gaming with their own unique aspects. a trend that Nintendo would always seek to improve on throughout the years. Despite lacking a main console release in the second generation, they would survive the American Atari shock and prepared to release one of the most powerful and influential consoles ever made, rejuvenating an entire industry nearly single-handedly.
Epoch was the other Japanese contributor to the second generation of gaming, being the sole competitor to Nintendo. Sure, there were other consoles that were made, but Nintendo didn't release a second generation console at all. Epoch, on the other hand, did. It was known as the Cassette Vision, which took the shell of the previous console, the Epoch TV Vader, a Space Invaders clone console, and ran with it, making a cartridge-based programmable console. The Cassette Vision had 4 knobs, one for vertical, one for horizontal, one pair per player. But the issue was that this style didn't fit the second generation at all. It's like Epoch was stuck in the previous generation, and as such only 400,000 units were sold and only 11 games were ever released. Epoch through and through was attempting to capitalize on the American success of Atari, but we all know how that ended. The revised console, the Cassette Vision Jr., was oddly successful, and due to the lack of competitors, it did generate some revenue for Epoch. In addition to their console, they released a handheld device in 1984 known as the Epoch Game Pocket Computer, but they are incredibly hard to find. And from an economic point of view, it's viewed as a commercial failure.
Despite their mixture of success and failures, Epoch still had one more trick up their sleeve, and they intended to appeal to a variety of audiences, both male and female. Could their next console live up to the standards the third generation would demand? Time would tell, and only one competitor stood in their way: Nintendo.
When you think of VTech, you probably think of their line of laptop and tablet-styled computers made for small children's entertainment. But that wasn't the aim of their 1986 release of the VTech CreateVision, an incredible oddity of the second generation. VTech was created in 1986 in Hong Kong and primarily focused on educational products for a long time, but their entrance into the gaming world was in the first generation. Their contribution was a Pong clone, and the CreateVision wasn't that far behind as a late bloomer in the second generation of gaming. So much so that it almost isn't considered a second generation console because it falls out of the timeline. The important thing to know is that it had a few games and that it was a full-fledged computer and featured a module to play ColecoVision titles as well. Internationally, it was present. It wasn't successful.
VTech made drastic changes in their business plan after the failure of the CreateVision, solely focusing on educational items, a move that would usher them into the next generation of gaming, naming their console after a well-known philosopher. So, there you have it, the second generation of game consoles. A time where creativity went out the window and everyone focused on making the same thing, a little bit better and in larger volume than their opponents. Fairchild introduced a concept, and yet again, Atari ran with it, as did RCA, APF, Interon, Gakken, SHG, Entex, and Palmex. As we enter the third generation of video game consoles, many of these companies couldn't make the cut and would shutter their doors forever. The industry was in shambles, and the future of it depended on the perseverance of those who still felt the fires of innovation with the newfound ideology of patience. These lucky few would set the foundations of modern gaming, some lasting far longer than others.